Tell the Duke I remember what he did the night his mother died." The old woman's voice was scarcely louder than the winter wind, yet it silenced the grand entrance hall of Blackwood Hall more completely than a thunderclap. Beneath crystal chandeliers and the golden trembling of 100 candles, Eleanor Hale stood dripping melted snow onto the polished marble, her silver hair escaping from a weather-beaten hood. Nearly 200 guests had gathered for the Duke of Blackwood's winter ball, each dressed in silk, velvet, and jewels bright enough to purchase a village. Not one stepped forward. Fans lifted discreetly. Faces turned away. Someone laughed behind a gloved hand. Lady Vanessa Caldwell, radiant in ivory satin, regarded the stranger as though poverty were an unpleasant stain upon the floor. "Remove her," she told the footman. "His Grace is not receiving beggars tonight." Eleanor opened her mouth to answer, but her strength failed. Her knees bent. A worn cloth bag slipped from her fingers, scattering yellowed letters across the marble. Shoes retreated before the falling papers. One polished heel crushed the corner of an envelope. Then Clara Bennet left her place beside the servant's door. She crossed the hall before caution could silence compassion, knelt beside the old woman, and gathered the letters with careful hands. Clara's brown dress was plain, her cuffs mended so neatly that the repairs looked almost deliberate. She owned no jewels. No title protected her. Yet when she lifted her chin toward the watching crowd, there was more dignity in her quiet gray eyes than in every jeweled face surrounding her. "She is freezing," Clara said. Vanessa's smile sharpened. "And you are forgetting your position." Clara removed her wool cloak and placed it around Eleanor's trembling shoulders. "No, my lady. I remember it perfectly." A murmur passed through the hall. Clara ignored it. She found a folded handkerchief and gently dried the old woman's hands, never glancing around to see who might praise her. From the shadowed landing above, Duke Alexander Whitmore watched without moving. Tall and severe in black evening clothes, he had observed the intrusion from the moment the doors opened. His guests believed his stillness meant indifference. They did not see the blood drain from his face when a small silver ring rolled from Eleanor's palm and spun across the marble. It stopped beside Clara's knee. She picked it up. The Whitmore crest had nearly worn smooth with age, but Alexander knew the narrow band and the tiny blue stone set beneath its seal. He had last seen it 20 years earlier on his mother's hand. Clara looked upward, following Eleanor's fixed gaze toward the landing. For one suspended moment, her eyes met the Duke's. She expected him to descend. He did not. Something within her expression cooled. Not fear, not submission, but disappointment. Eleanor closed her fingers around Clara's wrist. "Do not trust the silence in this house," she whispered. Vanessa signaled again to the footman. "Take them both away." Clara helped Eleanor stand, bearing most of the old woman's weight. As they turned toward the servants' passage, Eleanor looked back at Alexander. Candlelight caught the tears she refused to shed. "You stood there that night, too," she said. "You watched her leave, and by morning, your mother was dead." The accusation lingered beneath the chandeliers, cold and weightless as the snow pressing against the windows. For the first time that evening, Alexander Whitmore looked less like the master of Blackwood Hall and more like a man confronted by a ghost. Clara felt Eleanor tremble against her, but the old woman did not lower her gaze. Lady Vanessa recovered first. "This has gone far enough," she said, her voice polished and calm. "The woman is clearly confused. Grief and age can produce the most unfortunate fantasies." Several guests murmured their agreement, grateful for an explanation that required nothing from them. Alexander descended one step, then another. Clara waited, believing he would finally speak. Instead, he stopped halfway down the staircase, his hand resting upon the dark oak rail. "What is your name?" he asked. Eleanor gave a tired smile. "You know my name, Alexander." The use of his given name caused a ripple of shock through the room. Vanessa's expression hardened. "Your Grace, allowing this spectacle to continue will only encourage her." Alexander's gray eyes moved from the silver ring in Clara's hand to Eleanor's weathered face. Something painful flickered there, but it vanished behind years of discipline. "Take her somewhere warm," he told the footman. Clara almost mistook the order for mercy until Vanessa added, "The servant's entrance will be sufficient." Alexander did not correct her. That silence decided everything. Clara closed Eleanor's fingers around the silver ring and drew the old woman's arm over her shoulders. "I will take her," she said. Vanessa turned slowly. "You will return to your duties at once." "She can barely stand." "That is not your concern." Clara looked across the radiant hall, at tables heavy with food and fireplaces tall enough for a person to stand inside. Beyond the glass, the storm had swallowed the gardens beneath nearly 2 feet of snow. It became my concern when everyone else decided she was invisible. A few guests lowered their eyes. Vanessa stepped closer, her perfume sweet against the bitter draft. "You are employed here by the Duke's generosity. Do not confuse that generosity with importance." Clara's cheeks warmed, but her voice remained steady. "I have never confused the two." "Then choose carefully. Return to your place, and this foolishness will be forgotten. Walk away with her, and you will not enter this house again." Eleanor tightened her hand around Clara's arm. "Leave me, child," she whispered. "You have already done more than anyone." Clara thought of her mother in their small rented cottage, of the medicine due before week's end, of the wages she could not afford to lose. She thought of her father, condemned by people who had valued comfort more than truth. Then she looked at Alexander. He had witnessed every cruel word. He possessed enough power to end them with one sentence. Still, he said nothing. Clara lifted her chin. "Then I will not return." She guided Eleanor toward the narrow servants' corridor while whispers followed them like drifting ash. Behind her, Alexander's fingers closed around the railing until his knuckles whitened. Only when the door shut did he turn to his steward. "Lock every gate on the estate," he said quietly. "No carriage leaves Blackwood Hall tonight." The steward stared. "Your Grace." Alexander's gaze settled upon Vanessa, who was smiling as though she had won. "Someone in this house recognized Eleanor Hale," he replied. "And before midnight, they will try to make certain she never speaks to me again." Clara led Eleanor through the dim servants' passage while music resumed behind them, uncertain at first, then louder, as though the guests could bury discomfort beneath violins. The corridor narrowed toward the rear of Blackwood Hall, where the warmth of the ballroom faded into stone cold enough to numb the fingers. Eleanor's steps faltered twice. Each time, Clara steadied her without complaint. The old woman was lighter than she should have been, all fragile bones beneath wet wool. "There is an abandoned greenhouse beyond the east garden," Clara said. "The gardeners keep a small stove there for winter seedlings. It is not comfortable, but it is warm." They crossed the kitchen yard beneath a covered walkway. Snow swept sideways through the arches, whitening Clara's uncovered hair and clinging to her plain brown dress. The greenhouse stood nearly 100 yards from the house, a long shadow of iron and glass beside a frozen orchard. Several panes had cracked with age, and dead vines twisted along the frame like black thread, but a faint orange glow remained behind the fogged glass. Clara forced the swollen door open and guided Eleanor inside. The air smelled of damp soil, coal smoke, and rosemary struggling to survive the winter. She settled the old woman on a wooden bench near the stove, fed 2 small pieces of coal into the fading fire, and wrapped a burlap covering around Eleanor's boots. Only then did she kneel and examine the letters. Most were sealed with faded wax. One carried the name Amelia Whitmore. Clara's breath caught. The Duke's mother? Eleanor nodded. She was the finest woman this house ever failed. From beneath her dress, the old woman drew out a brass key tied to a narrow blue ribbon. "This opens a room in the West Wing. Alexander's father sealed it 20 years ago." Clara stared at the key but did not touch it. "Why come tonight?" "Because Lady Vanessa Caldwell intends to become Duchess of Blackwood before spring, and if she does, the truth will be buried forever." Eleanor's voice weakened, but her eyes remained clear. She explained that during the winter of Alexander's childhood, grain and coal meant for poor villages had vanished from the estate accounts. Duchess Amelia discovered that members of the Caldwell family had sold the supplies for private profit. Samuel Bennet, Clara's father, had helped her collect records. Before Amelia could present them, her carriage left Blackwood Hall during a storm and never reached its destination. Days later, Samuel was accused of stealing the missing funds. "My father died with that shame," Clara whispered. "He never stopped saying he was innocent." "Because he was." Eleanor placed the key in Clara's palm. Amelia hid the original ledger in her private room. She sent me away with half the correspondence and ordered me to return when Alexander was old enough to choose truth over his family name. Clara closed her fingers around the cold brass. Then why did you wait so long? Pain crossed Eleanor's face. Because I was afraid, and fear can wear the clothing of patience for many years. Outside, a dark figure moved between the snow-covered trees. Clara turned toward the glass. The glow from the stove reflected back at her, blurring the garden into shadow. Then one cracked pane gave a sudden rattle. Eleanor rose too quickly. Someone followed us. The greenhouse door shifted in its frame, though neither woman had touched it. The greenhouse door opened with a low wooden groan, and Clara rose at once, placing herself between Eleanor and the entrance. A tall figure stepped through the drifting snow, his black coat dusted white across the shoulders. Alexander closed the door behind him and stood in the dim amber glow of the stove, stripped of chandeliers, servants, and ceremony. Here, among cracked glass and sleeping plants, he looked less like a duke and more like a man who had followed a memory into the dark. Clara did not curtsy. "You should return to your guests, Your Grace." His gaze moved to the blue ribbon hanging from her closed hand. "That key belonged to my mother. So did the ring you watched roll across the floor." The words struck with quiet precision. Eleanor lowered her eyes, but Clara did not. "You saw a woman freezing in your hall," she continued. "You heard her ask for you. Yet you stood above everyone and waited to learn whether helping her would cost you anything." Alexander's jaw tightened. "You know nothing of what I feared." "No," Clara said. "I only know what you chose." Wind pressed against the glass, making the old iron frame whisper around them. Alexander approached the stove but stopped several feet away, careful not to crowd Eleanor. "I recognized her the moment she spoke," he admitted. "Eleanor disappeared after my mother's death. For 20 years, every account I received claimed she had stolen jewelry and fled the county." Eleanor gave a hollow laugh. "Your father wrote those accounts. I know that now." Alexander looked toward the letters spread across the bench. "But when you arrived tonight, after 2 decades, carrying my mother's ring and accusing people in a crowded hall, I could not know whether you came with truth or with a story designed to destroy this house." Clara's expression softened only enough to reveal disappointment beneath anger. "Then you could have asked her in private. Instead, you allowed Lady Vanessa to send her into a storm." Alexander had commanded armies of tenants, magistrates, and men twice Clara's age without being challenged. Yet before this young woman in a mended dress, he found no defense that did not sound like cowardice dressed as caution. Eleanor lifted her face. "Your mother once told me that power makes silence appear respectable. She feared you would learn that lesson from your father." Alexander turned away, staring through the clouded panes at the white garden. "I was 15 the night she left," he said. "She came to my room carrying a leather case. She told me there were things I would soon hear about her, and that I must remember she loved me. I was angry. My father had spent weeks calling her unstable, reckless, dangerous to the family name." His voice lowered. "I told her I believed him." The stove gave a soft crackle. Eleanor's eyes closed. "She waited outside your door for nearly an hour." Alexander's face went still. "I heard her. And you did not open it." "No," the word was scarcely a breath. Clara felt the weight of his confession settle into the cold greenhouse. This was not a wound he displayed for sympathy. It was a chamber he had sealed within himself. Eleanor reached toward him, but stopped before touching his sleeve. "She did not leave because you rejected her. She left because she had found proof that the Caldwell family and your father had taken winter supplies meant for 5 villages. Samuel Bennett helped her copy the accounts. They planned to place everything before the county magistrate at dawn." Alexander looked sharply at Clara. "Your father?" She opened her hand, revealing the brass key. "The man your family disgraced." Before Alexander could answer, the rear pane shattered inward with a burst of snow and brittle glass. A cloaked figure reached through the opening toward Clara's hand. She stepped back, shielding the key against her chest, while Alexander moved between the stranger and the 2 women. The figure fled into the storm before his face could be seen. On the sill, caught beneath a shard of glass, lay a strip of ivory silk embroidered with a single golden thread. Alexander seized the strip of ivory silk before the wind could carry it away. The golden thread caught the stove light with a familiar gleam. Clara had seen the same embroidery only an hour earlier along the edge of Lady Vanessa Caldwell's gloves. "You recognize it," Alexander said. "I recognize the pattern," Clara replied. "That is not the same as proof." Eleanor sank back onto the bench, one hand pressed to her chest as she struggled to steady her breathing. Clara knelt beside her and adjusted the wool cloak around her shoulders. Beyond the broken pane, snow drifted across the floor in a thin white line. Alexander moved to the door. "Stay here." Clara rose. "No." He turned, unaccustomed to being answered so quickly. "The person who came through that window was searching for the key, which is why I will not remain in the place where they already know to look." Her voice remained calm, but her fingers had tightened around the brass. "And if you confront Lady Vanessa now, she will deny everything, destroy whatever remains, and accuse Eleanor of inventing the entire story." Alexander studied her. "What do you suggest?" The question surprised them both. Clara looked toward the dark outline of Blackwood Hall through the storm. "Let them believe they succeeded." Eleanor opened her eyes. "The key? We will say it was taken," Clara answered. "Whoever sent that person will act before midnight, because they will believe the locked room is no longer protected." Alexander's gaze sharpened. "You expect them to lead us to the evidence." "I expect fear to make them careless." For the first time that night, something resembling respect softened the severity of his expression. He removed his coat and placed it over Eleanor's shoulders, then crossed to a cabinet where the gardeners kept old cloth and twine. Together, without ceremony, they covered the broken pane and fed the stove until the greenhouse warmed again. Eleanor watched them in silence, as though seeing two pieces of a long-separated truth finally placed beside one another. When they returned to the manor, Alexander used the narrow east passage to avoid the ballroom. He summoned his steward, Mr. Henry Cole, a gray-haired man who had served the Whitmore family since Alexander's childhood. Cole listened with grave attention as Alexander described the attempted theft, though he did not mention the surviving key. "Seal the greenhouse," Alexander ordered. "Question every servant assigned to the east wing." Cole bowed. "At once, Your Grace." Clara noticed the steward's right cuff. A single golden thread clung to the dark fabric. Her breath caught, but she said nothing until he had gone. "You saw it," Alexander murmured. "Yes. Cole has been in this house for 30 years. Then he knows every locked door and every lie used to protect it." Alexander's face hardened, wounded less by suspicion than by the possibility of betrayal. "I should have him detained." Clara stepped closer, lowering her voice. "And warn the person he serves?" He looked down at her, the silence between them no longer cold but charged with shared danger. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Clara glanced toward the distant music, where Vanessa still entertained guests beneath the chandeliers. "Return to the ballroom. Tell everyone the old woman was confused, the key was stolen, and nothing she said can be trusted." Pain moved across his eyes. "You are asking me to humiliate you before the same people who already judged you. I am asking you to make them believe we have lost." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "And you?" Clara closed her hand around the hidden key. "I will find out who becomes brave when they think the truth is defenseless." The orchestra swelled as Alexander returned to the ballroom, and conversation faded beneath the authority of his presence. Clara followed several paces behind, her plain dress still damp at the hem, while Eleanor remained hidden in a small sitting room near the east passage under the care of a trusted maid. Lady Vanessa turned toward them with a smile too quick to be innocent. "Your Grace," she said, "I trust the disturbance has been resolved." Alexander stopped beneath the chandelier. Every face lifted toward him. "The woman was confused," he said. The words fell heavily. Clara kept her expression still. "The key she carried was taken during the confusion, and nothing she claimed can be verified." Relief passed through the room like warm air. Vanessa lowered her gaze, but not before Clara saw triumph brighten her eyes. "How unfortunate," she murmured. "And the girl?" Alexander looked at Clara. For one brief second, she saw apology beneath the coldness he had put on for the room. Then it vanished. Miss Bennet acted without permission and abandoned her duties. The whispers began at once. Clara heard the words foolish, ambitious, and ungrateful move through the crowd. A woman near the fireplace laughed softly. Another guest asked whether compassion had become fashionable among servants. Clara stood beneath their judgment with her hands folded, the brass key concealed inside her sleeve. The performance was working. That knowledge should have protected her. It did not. Years earlier, she had watched neighbors turn away when her father was accused. They had known his character. They had accepted the easier story. Now Alexander's silence carried the same shape, even though she had asked him to wear it. "She will leave Blackwood Hall at dawn," he finished. Vanessa's smile deepened. Music resumed. Servants moved again. The room decided the matter was over. Alexander crossed toward a group of county officials, forcing himself not to look back. Clara returned to the edge of the ballroom and waited. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. At last, Mr. Cole entered through the west corridor. He did not approach Vanessa. He merely adjusted his cuff. Vanessa lifted her fan once, slowly, then turned toward the dance floor. The signal was small enough to escape anyone who was not searching for it. Clara slipped through the servants' door. The west wing lay beyond a portrait gallery closed for winter, its air colder and stiller than the rest of the house. She moved without a candle, guided by faint moonlight filtering through tall windows. Behind her came the soft rustle of Eleanor's borrowed cloak. "You should be resting," Clara whispered. "I have rested for 20 years," Eleanor replied. It was long enough. Together they reached the sealed corridor. At its end stood a narrow oak door marked by a faded blue ribbon tied around the handle. Clara drew out the key. Before she could insert it, footsteps sounded from the gallery. She and Eleanor stepped behind a heavy curtain. Mr. Cole appeared carrying a lantern, followed by Vanessa. "The key is gone," he said. "The Duke believes the evidence is lost." Vanessa removed one ivory glove. "Then open the room with the duplicate and destroy everything before midnight." Cole reached inside his coat and produced a second brass key. Clara felt Eleanor's hand tighten around hers. The locked door opened with a quiet click. Vanessa and Cole entered. Clara waited until their lantern light disappeared, then emerged from the shadows. Eleanor looked at her. "Now." Clara placed the true key into the lock. "Now we learn what they were willing to bury." The hidden room smelled of dust, lavender, and years deliberately forgotten. Clara closed the door behind them, leaving only a narrow line of darkness beneath it. Moonlight slipped through tall windows veiled by linen sheets, revealing furniture preserved beneath white covers and a writing desk still arranged as though Duchess Amelia might return before morning. Eleanor stood motionless. "Nothing has changed," she whispered. Clara moved toward the desk and found a leather ledger beneath a false panel, its pages filled with village names, delivery dates, and quantities of grain and coal. Beside it lay letters bearing Samuel Bennett's careful signature. "My father wrote these." Her voice nearly failed. One letter warned that families were already going hungry, while supply wagons listed as delivered had never arrived. Another promised Amelia that he would testify, regardless of the cost. Clara pressed the paper to her chest for one brief moment, then forced herself to continue. There would be time for grief after truth was safe. Eleanor opened a small wooden box and removed a sealed envelope addressed to Alexander. She wrote this the night she left. Footsteps crossed the adjoining chamber. Vanessa's voice came through the darkness. "Search the desk." Cole said Amelia hid copies everywhere. Clara extinguished the small lamp. She and Eleanor slipped behind a folding screen as lantern light entered the room. Mr. Cole lifted the ledger from the desk, but Vanessa seized it from him. "This is enough to ruin both our families." "It also proves Samuel Bennett was innocent," Cole said. "That no longer matters." Vanessa carried the ledger toward the fireplace. Clara stepped from hiding. "It matters to me." Vanessa froze. Cole turned pale. Eleanor emerged beside Clara holding Amelia's letter. For an instant, no one spoke. Then Vanessa's surprise hardened into contempt. "You should have accepted your dismissal. And you should have mistaken silence for safety less often," Clara replied. Vanessa glanced toward Cole. He moved to the door and turned the key, locking them inside. "The Duke will never believe a servant over the woman he intends to marry," Vanessa said. "He already doubts everything you claim." Clara felt the old wound of the ballroom open again, but she did not lower her eyes. "Then why are you afraid of these papers?" Vanessa's hand tightened around the ledger. A candle near the curtains tipped as she turned too quickly. The flame caught the dry fabric, first as a golden thread, then as a widening glow. Cole rushed to smother it, but smoke began gathering beneath the ceiling. Eleanor coughed and stumbled. Clara could have reached the side passage alone. Instead, she crossed the room, wrapped Amelia's linen cover around Eleanor's shoulders, and guided her toward the narrow servant's door behind the wardrobe. "Take the letter," Clara said. "Do not lose it. Come with me. I need the ledger." Across the room, Vanessa had dropped it beside the hearth. Clara covered her mouth with her sleeve and moved through the smoke. The door behind them shook beneath a heavy blow. Then Alexander's voice sounded from the corridor. "Clara." The locked door opened as Cole finally released it, and Alexander entered through the haze. He found Eleanor near the hidden passage and placed his coat around her, but Clara was still beside the fireplace, reaching for the leather book. "Leave it," he called. She looked at him through the smoke, her face pale and resolute. "My father already lost his life to their lie. He will not lose his name." She seized the ledger and crossed toward him as the curtains fell in a bright curtain of sparks behind her. Alexander took Eleanor's weight with one arm and reached for Clara with the other. Together they entered the corridor, carrying the woman, the letter, and the truth that Blackwood Hall had failed to bury. The ballroom doors opened, and every conversation died beneath the sight of Alexander carrying Eleanor into the hall, while Clara followed with the smoke-darkened ledger pressed against her chest. Soot marked the hem of her dress. A narrow red line crossed one palm where the leather binding had scraped her skin, but she held the book as though it contained every breath her father had been denied. Behind them came Mr. Cole, pale and silent, and Lady Vanessa, whose elegance had finally begun to fracture. Alexander lowered Eleanor into a chair beside the great fireplace, then turned toward the assembled guests. "No one leaves." His voice was calm. That made it more powerful. The orchestra stopped. Servants closed the doors. Vanessa stepped forward. "Alexander, this has become absurd." The old woman brought forged papers, and that servant entered a private room where she had no right to be. Clara looked at her. "Then explain why you were already inside." A murmur moved through the hall. Vanessa's face tightened. "I followed because I feared she intended theft." "With a duplicate key?" Alexander asked. Mr. Cole lowered his head. The silence around him became unbearable. "I made it years ago," he said at last, "on the late Duke's orders." Alexander opened the ledger upon a long table beneath the chandelier. Page after page recorded shipments of coal, flour, and winter grain that had supposedly reached 5 villages. Clara placed beside it the letters signed by Samuel Bennett, each one warning that the deliveries had never arrived. Eleanor unfolded Amelia's final letter with trembling hands. Alexander recognized his mother's handwriting before she spoke a word. "Read it," he said. Eleanor began softly, but her voice strengthened as the truth filled the room. Amelia had discovered that Alexander's father and members of the Caldwell family had sold relief supplies through private merchants, leaving families without food or heat. Samuel Bennett had gathered the records. He had not stolen from Blackwood Hall. He had tried to expose it. Vanessa lifted her chin. "Whatever our fathers did has nothing to do with me." Clara turned several pages in the ledger. "These entries do." The ink was newer. The dates were from the past 2 years. Money assigned to village schools and widows' pensions had been redirected through accounts bearing the Caldwell seal. Clara pointed to the repeated mark beside each transfer. "You continued the system." Vanessa's composure broke. "You are a dismissed servant. Your interpretation means nothing." "Then perhaps mine will," Alexander said. He faced the county magistrate among his guests. "You will take custody of these records tonight." Vanessa looked toward Cole. He closed his eyes. "She ordered me to remove the remaining papers," he confessed. "She said the Duke would never question the woman he planned to marry." Every gaze turned toward Alexander. He did not look away. "She was correct about one thing," he said. "I allowed familiarity to disguise corruption and caution to disguise cowardice." Then he faced Clara before the same people who had mocked her. "Miss Bennett asked for no favor. She acted when every person in this hall, including me, found a reason not to." Clara's eyes shone, but her voice remained steady. "This is not only about my father. There are names in that ledger. Families who lost children, homes, and winters they can never recover." Alexander nodded and stepped beside her rather than in front of her. "Then they will be named." Clara opened Samuel's final letter and read his last words aloud. When she finished, no one whispered. No one laughed. In that vast hall, beneath the cold brilliance of the chandeliers, Samuel Bennett's name was restored not by mercy, but by truth. In the weeks that followed, Blackwood Hall changed more than it had in 20 years. The county magistrate opened the estate records, the Caldwell accounts were seized, and every family named in the ledger received restitution from the Whitmore fortune. Alexander did not hide behind his father's reputation or the customs of another generation. He signed each order himself. Coal was delivered before the next storm. Grain returned to the village stores. The abandoned school reopened. Above its entrance, a new brass plaque bore the name Samuel Bennett. Clara stood before it with her mother on a clear winter morning, the sky pale blue above the rooftops. Her mother touched the engraved letters with trembling fingers. "He would have said this was too much," she whispered. Clara smiled through the ache in her chest. He would have known it was only the truth. Eleanor moved into a warm cottage on the eastern edge of the estate, close enough to see the greenhouse from her window. Alexander restored Duchess Amelia's letters to the family archive and placed her portrait in the Great Hall without a veil. He also dismissed the tradition that allowed only noblemen to oversee the estate charities. In its place, he proposed a council that included village teachers, widows, tenant farmers, and working women. When he offered Clara its leadership, she did not accept at once. They stood in his study beside the leather ledger, now repaired but still darkened at the edges. "I will not become a symbol you display to prove this house has changed," she said. Alexander received the words without offense. "Then tell me what must change." "The council must control its own accounts. Every payment must be public. No one appointed by title alone may hold more power than those who live with the consequences." "Agreed." "And Eleanor will have a permanent place among the trustees." "Agreed." Clara studied him. "You did not argue." A faint sadness touched his expression. "I spent too many years believing authority meant never being questioned." She accepted the position the following morning. Months passed. Winter loosened its hold, and the greenhouse was rebuilt with clear glass, fresh ironwork, and long beds of rosemary and white roses. Clara often worked there when the council papers became too heavy with numbers and sorrow. One spring afternoon, she found Alexander waiting near the doorway, holding no documents and wearing no formal coat. He had learned not to enter her silence without invitation. "Eleanor says the first roses will bloom within a week," he said. "She is usually right." He looked toward the bench where Clara had once wrapped the old woman in borrowed wool. "I believed that night I had discovered something rare in you." Clara turned to him. "And now I understand your worth existed before I saw it. My attention changed nothing about you. It only revealed how much blindness I had mistaken for judgment." The air between them became quiet, but it was no longer the silence of fear or shame. Alexander extended his hand, then stopped before reaching hers. "May I walk with you?" Clara looked through the open door at the path stretching between the greenhouse and the village, bright beneath the afternoon sun. She placed her hand lightly in his. For a while, they walked side by side, not master and servant, not rescuer and rescued, two people carrying different wounds toward the same horizon. Behind them, the restored glass caught the light, and for the first time in many years, Blackwood Hall did not look like a place guarding its ghosts. It looked like a home learning to open its doors. Alexander had once believed kindness was a weakness noticed only by fools. Clara taught him that true kindness asks for no witness, no title, and no reward. He had not given her value by seeing her. He had only learned how blind power could become.